Hi, this is Tim with Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, here live via Skype with James Jacob Prash, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. Welcome to This Week in Prophecy as we look at global and Middle Eastern events in light of the prophetic predictions of God's Word for the last days. You know, let's begin with something that's transpired very significant this week in prophecy that has not received a tremendous amount of media attention outside of Israel, but it has attracted a very definite and conspicuous amount of attention in the press and in the media inside of Israel.
More on all of this with E.J. Kimball. He's a security analyst at the Middle East Forum. E.J., thanks for being with us. And as we just heard from Tal, Netanyahu confirming that Israel is taking out Iranian targets in Syria. The IDF says, despite this, that Iran is continuing to try and improve its ability to launch rockets from Syria. So does this mean that Israel could be setting up to up the ante here?
I think this is a incredible shift that the Prime Minister announced today. I really can't underscore that enough. The fact that he's bringing up the theological aspect within Islam of the battle between Sunni and Shia over supremacy within Islam can't be understated. This is out of the norm within Israel when dealing with the threat from Iran. Clearly, we know that Iran is seeking to expand across the entire region, and that's been going on for a while, and the Israelis have been very clear that they're not going to allow that to happen. However, why this change today of announcing about the Iranian attempts to import Shia into Syria and to cause the Sunni Muslims to flee and to take refuge in Europe? I believe that this is a message that is being sent to the Sunni Arab countries, to the people. The leadership of these countries understand the threat that they are under from Iran, and they are working with the Israelis. But the people are hostile to Israel. The people have not been conditioned to work with Israel and with Jews. And so this message is being sent to the religious establishment, to the imams within these countries, to tell them this isn't about Israel's future. This is about Sunni versus Shia. This is about the supremacy within Islam. This is a threat to your control over these areas that you've been in control for 1,400 years. This is a message to get their support, to get the people on board, so that when the leaders in these countries go forward with some sort of action to get rid of this threat from the Iranian regime, that there will be broad support.
And EJ, to that point, he's not just addressing this to the Middle East and the area there that could suffer from this. He's also bringing up quite consistently, he did it in his European tour, that this would also lead to more refugees that could then flood into Europe and potentially lead to more terrorist attacks on European soil from these people. Is that likely to get more action from the Europeans? The Europeans dread the idea of more refugees. What kind of response could we get from Europe because of this?
Yeah, this definitely is part of an effort as well, I think secondarily, because I do believe that this is speaking to the religious establishment within Islam, within Sunni Islam. Within Europe, there's a big difference between the European Union and individual European countries. And we're seeing this especially in the Eastern European countries, this resistance against the constant influx of immigrants into the country or refugees into their countries. And even with some of the traditional countries, even countries like France, are having their problems and want to resist this continuous flow of refugees. So this is a message as well regarding the Iran nuclear deal, that Iran is not an ally, they're an adversary, and it's time to get on board with this and just accept the reality, because otherwise, yes, you will have an increasing influx of Sunni Muslims who come in with sleeper cells that come in, because there will be no way of properly vetting these people that come in, and it will overwhelm your system, and you are incapable of absorbing these types of numbers.
EJ, I want to bring the Russian angle into this conversation because Russia has given Israel the green light to do what it needs to protect its security and take action against Iran in Syria. Russia also stated quite clearly that it wants Iran out of Syria. But at the same time, we have Syria's Assad al-Bashar saying that, firstly, he denies that Iran has a military base in Syria, but he says that Iran is an ally, just like Russia, and that he still needs the assistance of Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria, and that they will stay in the country as long as he deems necessary. Is Syria going against Iran here? What do you make of these comments?
Well, the
Syria
Russians,
going against
while
Russia.
they've given, right. On the one hand, Russia, while they have given Israel the green light, they've been pretty clear during the World Cup that they do not want either side to escalate anything to cause a distraction from Russia's attempt to be a leader on the world stage right now. I think what we're seeing is the fact that Bashar al-Assad understands that his future is tied as an Alawite minority, that his future to control this western part of Syria is controlled to the Iranians. It's controlled by Hezbollah. It's controlled by the Iranian regime continuing to support him by bringing this influx of Shia Muslims to surround the area that he wants to maintain control over, get rid of the Sunni Muslims, which will be a threat and are a threat to his continued rule. And while the Russians don't want this shift to happen, the question is, how much are the Russians willing to invest to prevent this from happening? And, I don't believe that the Russians are willing to put the type of sacrifice in place to maintain their control without an Iranian influence, because that would require, it seems at this point, the removal of Bashar al-Assad. And it's not like the Russians want to sit there and install a new leader in the western part of Syria.
Right. Israel probably doing a lot of Russia's dirty work for it. E.J. Kimball, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We spoke of this last week in Prophecy, that an Israeli delegation was going to meet with a high-level defense delegation from Russia at the behest of Mr. Putin and Mr. Netanyahu's own meeting, where they agreed that such an exchange of ideas and exploring the possibility of some cooperation concerning the Syrian border was to be discussed. Russian General Sergei Shoigu came and met with Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman and other senior officials from the Israeli General Staff, with some accompanying Russian military commanders of a high rank. The meeting took place, and there appears to be something of a tentative border agreement between Russia and Israel. Now, this tells us a number of things, all of which are important. The first thing it tells us is Russia is not keen to have any military conflict with Israel at the present time. We'll come back to that in a moment. Russia knows it would not be in a position without escalating to a more global-sized conflict that it wants to avoid if Israel invaded the area between Damascus and the Golan Heights in southern Syria. Russia would be virtually powerless to do anything. If Iran and Iranian-animated Hezbollah forces from Lebanon continued or persisted in their attacks on Israeli positions on the Golan Heights, there was to be an Israeli ground response, as there have already been air responses. Bearing in mind in eastern Syria, possibly as many as 300 Russian mercenaries. And these were not ordinary mercenaries. They were recruited by the Russian equivalent of the American Blackwell defense contractor from Russian special forces, and were killed by American Marines and Kurdish nationalist forces, advised, equipped, and financed by the United States. Russia does not want any more of that. It was very difficult to contain it and to bury it, even in the media inside of Russia. Russia does not want any more problems. It wants to perpetuate its own strategic aims without any further military conflict with the United States or American-sponsored forces, or for that matter, the French as a possibility, and certainly not with Israel. Putin is restraining. Now, the second thing it tells us is this: the utter powerlessness, despite his protests to the contrary, of Assad and the Syrian regime. He remains in power at the behest of Russia and Iran, particularly Russia. Now Russia is outruling and overruling Iran, and Assad will comply with what Russia demands of him. That's the second thing it tells us. The third thing it tells us is there is a continual deterioration of Iran's prowess and position in its drive to establish a Shia caliphate controlled from Tehran through northern Iraq into eastern Syria and then through into western Syria into Lebanon, linking up with Hezbollah, whom Iran again largely supplies, funds, and controls. This is being interrupted by the Israelis, by the Americans, and now with Russian cooperation, Iran has a setback. The third thing it's telling us is this. Lebanon, following its elections, when the pro-Shia forces and interests in southern Lebanon made substantial gains in the Lebanese elections, as Shia interests made substantial gains in the recent Iraqi elections. The government of Lebanon, and to a degree the government of Iraq, knows they are in a strategically sensitive situation with the United States in Iraq and with Israel in Lebanon. They do not want another war with Israel in Lebanon, as Israel would again make an incursion probably up to the Litani River in southern Lebanon. The Israelis did not want to reoccupy Lebanon due to the fiasco that happened the last time they were compelled to do it in self-defense to stop the Katyusha attacks on Galilee. This time, however, the Israeli presence would be more permanent and might send tens of thousands of Shia refugees into Beirut. The Lebanese government wants to avoid this. The conflict in Syria could easily spread to Lebanon, given the prominence of Iranian-backed Hezbollah military positions and terrorist cells ready to operate throughout southern Lebanon. These are well fortified and are heavily armed with thousands and thousands of rockets, not mere Katyushas, but as we've reported in the past, more advanced rockets of longer range, where almost anywhere in central as well as obviously northern Israel and Galilee can easily be hit. This would unleash a maelstrom of Israeli response. The Lebanese government doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. But it could have easily happened. Mr. Putin, realizing these realities, is curtailing Hezbollah operations inside of Syria to the detriment of Iranian ambitions. So you've got this cooperation. A final thing it tells us is, beware of the boy who cried wolf. We are all, including ourselves, aware of a potential Gog and Magog scenario, where there's not going to simply be the Gog and Magog that the New Testament speaks of at the end of the millennial reign of Christ, but another one foreshadowing it, where military debris will be cleaned up from the battlefield for 7 months, etc. We've always looked at this and we've always examined events in light of it. But we've also been cautious. You have the this is it, this is it, this is it emphasis. People who behave like ignorant crackpots. I think, and I'm not attacking him personally, but he's theologically and doctrinally ignorant. And he's, frankly, a crackpot, J.D. Farragut.
And as candidly as I can say that, and I've shared this in the past, but I would literally, this is not hyperbole, if it were not for the blessed hope of the soon return of Jesus Christ and the rapture, and again, please know, and God knows my heart, I would go literally insane. Mm-hmm. I would lose my mind.
I wouldn't believe.
I wouldn't be able to handle what my eyes see. The evil and the darkness is such that, and the likes of which we've never seen in human history. And the Lord knows that. And one of the things the Lord's been ministering to me as of late is that He eagerly awaits His return for His bride. And because He knows that how perilous it's going to be and is in the last days.
The man is a crackpot, a scaremonger, a sensationalist. Every time something happens, he begins jumping up and down and yelling Ezekiel 38 and 39. Well, now we're backing away from that again. It becomes the boy who cried wolf. The danger with crackpots who scream the boy cried wolf is that when something really does happen of actual prophetic significance, this is it. People will be tired of hearing it and no longer listen to the alarms and warnings because there's been too many false alarms published by doctrinally and theologically ignorant crackpots. Ignorant people. Now, there are credible people who address these issues. Amir Sephardi is credible. He's a credible voice. But he's not a crackpot. He's not a crackpot. He's credible. He's not a sensationalist. He does not simply read a few things from newspapers and begin screaming and hypothesizing and conjecturing. J.D. Farag, of course, is so driven by the pre-tribulational view that becomes his, what we call in Yiddish, a shtick, his gimmick. Now, he's a confused man in many respects. Confused. First, he reneges on his view that the rapture is to be equated with the apostasy of 2 Thessalonians based on the bogus apostiamai argument that was originally published by Seventh-day Adventists. He backs away from that, and then he embraces it again, even though people who know better, like Mark Hitchcock, warned them otherwise. He doesn't read Greek. He doesn't read Hebrew. He has no real background in international affairs. This is what Jesus called the sheep nature. Sheep are easily excitable. They need to hear the voice of a shepherd that is calm, confident, and accurate. They need to hear the voice of Christ. Again, it pains me to say these things, but the body of Christ needs to be warned about a boy who continually cries wolf. If this continues, when the wolf actually shows up, nobody will pay attention to such warnings anymore. This is the reality. And so we have some kind of a concordance this week in prophecy between Putin's Russia and Mr. Netanyahu's Israel concerning border security in southern Syria. A backing away for the time being of a Gog and Magog scenario. Now again, the Middle East is a powder keg. Things can change very quickly. They can reignite very quickly. But when you begin telling people it's a countdown to Gog and Magog, fasten your seatbelts, get ready, this kind of scaremongering, this is not constructive and it's not scriptural. Again, I see so many people like this. Now, I don't mean people who are not educated. But in the scripture, the educated people, like Apollos and Paul, instructed the others. They even, to a degree, instructed the other apostles about certain things. Peter acknowledges this. I don't make an idol of education. But there are those whom the Lord has allowed to be educated, who God uses. He doesn't use people who don't know what they're talking about, who just rant, who are scaremongers, who try to take theological positions about Greek words when they can't even read Greek themselves. These are crackpots. I love him as a brother, especially because he's an Arab. I love the guy as a brother, but as a preacher, he's a crackpot. He ought to shut up. He does more harm than good. Amir Sephardi is different. He was in the Israeli military. He was an officer of medium senior ranking. He knows people. He's based in Israel. He doesn't say ridiculous things. The Lord uses his military background. Although I would disagree with him on 1 or 2 points doctrinally, he's not a theological charlatan or anything. His basic doctrine is good. You can listen to somebody like that because he carries a degree of credibility, of calmness, of caution. I've got no problem with it. I don't know him well. I've met him in Israel, of course, and I do like him, and I appreciate his ministry, generally speaking. But he's one kind of person. Listening to somebody like him, that makes a degree of sense. But the body of Christ needs to be warned. These events in the Middle East are very serious. They are harbingers of the return of the Lord. They are indeed of immense prophetic significance, and they must be handled intelligently and scripturally. Let's look. Remember, Jesus said, "You will see these things, wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet." Jesus tells us directly these things are going to happen before the end. They will show you, indicate the end is getting closer, but the end is not yet. None of this figures in the mentality of these boys who cry wolf. Well, this meeting that took place, that was brokered in the previous meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Netanyahu, is for the time being quite important. It does display that Assad of Syria is not in control of Syria. No matter what he says, he's taking his orders to a large degree from Russia. Now, there has been an upgraded deployment of an American carrier task force led by the USS Truman, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, with a very heavy F-18 contingency of attack aircraft, probably some seaborne F-35s. I'm not sure. It's not disclosed as classified. Right off the coast of Syria, where the Russian Navy is obviously unloading hardware to support Assad. Mr. Putin does not want a conflict with Mr. Trump. He knows Mr. Trump is not a weakling like Mr. Obama. When Mr. Trump draws a line, the line is there. When Obama drew the line and Assad crossed it, Obama did nothing. Putin knew Obama was spineless. He knows that Mr. Trump is not. Mr. Trump believes in peace through strength. Putin is playing a wise game. He undoubtedly has some interest in the potential oil and natural gas production that's already underway to a degree in the subaquatic sea mass between Cyprus and Israel. He's well aware of the secret military cooperation with the British-backed Cypriots, the Americans, and the Israelis concerning those energy interests. France is also an outer circle partner. He knows this. He knows that these things will affect the value and the price of Russia's own exports of oil and natural gas. He has a vested interest in cooperating with the West in order to bring some kind of economic stability to a very troubled Russian economy that is dependent upon oil and natural gas exports. He's forced to deal with this. Let's continue looking at This Week in Prophecy. This Week in Prophecy. FIFA, the International Governing Board of Soccer, that is football, international football, has launched an investigation and decided on some kind of disciplinary action against the Palestinian Arab Football Association, citing Jibril Rajoub.
World governing soccer body, FIFA, has started disciplinary proceedings against the Palestinian Football Association's chief, Jibril Rajoub, over his comment against Lionel Messi. Rajoub had urged fans to burn pictures, shirt of Argentina captain Messi if he played against Israel in Jerusalem. George Sampaoli's men were billed to play at Jerusalem's Teddy Kollek Stadium in a World Cup warm-up match. The match was eventually cancelled, and Rajoub played a major part. On Thursday, FIFA confirmed that it had opened an inquiry. The FIFA Disciplinary Committee has opened disciplinary proceedings against the president of the Palestinian Football Association, Jibril Rajoub, the soccer body said in a statement. The decision came as a result of his statements, widely reported in the media, with respect to the international friendly match that was scheduled to take place on 9 June 2018 between Israel and Argentina. Close quote. Rotem Kamer, vice president of the Israeli FA, has accused Rajoub of football terror. The association's chairman, Ofarini, said in a statement Thursday that Rajoub had crossed each and every red line.
لا يمكن أن نقبل تحت أي ظرف من الظروف إنه هاي المباراة تصير. إحنا ابتداء من اليوم راح نبدأ في حملة ضد الاتحاد الأرجنتيني ونستهدف فيها ميسي شخصيا اللي له عشرات الملايين من المعجبين والمحبين، سواء كان في دول العربية، الدول الإسلامية، في آسيا، في أفريقيا، وفي الدول الصديقة للشعب الفلسطيني. Direct message to Messi. Messi, don't come. Don't white face the racism, the fascism, the occupation, and the systematic violations of human rights and status of FIFA. Messi, this is a political event. Don't come. You will gain nothing from this event. The contrary, you will lose fans all over the world.
Jibril Rajoub politicized football, urging fans to burn photos of Lionel Messi. And there was an engagement in threatening and intimidation that caused Argentina to cancel a football match in Israel. FIFA has responded. Again, the politicization of sport. Now, this is an international phenomenon. It has certainly happened with ESPN in America, Disney-owned. What does a television channel that exists to provide sports entertainment doing being transformed into a political platform for people to make politically charged speeches against Mr. Trump and things like this? But that's what's happening. Take what's happening in the United States to the power of 10. That's what transpires in the Muslim world. Even at cricket games in Pakistan, when Australia or Britain play in Pakistan, to the fans, the local fans, it is not simply a cricket game. It is a reflection of the jihad aspirations of Islam against the West. It's part of their religious, political philosophy of resentment and opposition to the non-Islamic world. It is Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb in Islamic theology. They see it that way. It's not mere sport to them. It's politicized along a radical religious line. People in the West need to understand this. Now, it may not be true of all Islamic countries, but it's true of most of them. Let's continue this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, the United States managed to kill the Taliban chief in Pakistan and in part of Afghanistan.
There was a $5 million bounty on his head. Mullah Fazlullah was arguably one of the most dangerous men in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. He was the head of the radical movement Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and was known for his hatred of Americans and the Pakistani state. But on Friday, Afghanistan's defense ministry said Fazlullah was dead, killed in a drone attack near the border with Pakistan. U.S. officials said it was a counter-terrorism strike.
This commander was blamed for some complex attacks, especially in Pakistan, in Peshawar back in 2014, that killed over 150 people in military school, and also some other major attacks that actually made this group very well known.
Fazlullah was accused of killing hundreds of Pakistani security forces and civilians in several large-scale attacks during the last 5 years, and of ordering the shooting of Pakistani activist Malala Yousafzai in 2012. Afghan officials say Fazlullah's death is a significant development in the fight against terrorism and will improve relations with Pakistan and the US. A day after his killing, the Afghan Taliban agreed to a temporary ceasefire with the government. It coincides with the end of the holy month of Ramadan, or Eid al-Fitr.
This year, armed Talibans welcomed our invitation and announced a ceasefire during Eid days. The hope is that this ceasefire will continue, so there is no more bloodshed.
It's the first time the Taliban had declared a nationwide ceasefire in the nearly 17-year conflict. Many Afghans expressed cautious optimism at the announcement to celebrate a rare Eid without violence. Regan Evans, TRT World.
Mullah Fazlullah Khorsandi is the absolute villain. Now, he's a clergyman. We have to understand, again, the differences between radical Islam and the civilized world. In more moderate Muslim countries, in the United States, in Great Britain, and in Europe, a chaplain, a clergyman in the military, is non-combatant. In Israel, a rabbi or a Christian chaplain in the IDF is known as lo kravi. They're like a medic. They are non-combatant. They are not there for any military purpose other than providing spiritual guidance, counseling services to soldiers or military personnel. In the radical Islamic world, it's not like that. This guy was a warlord as a clergyman. Mullah Fazlullah Khorsandi was responsible for the murder of 132 Muslim children in 2014. There was a $5 million reward for his capture. It was also him who attempted to kill Malala Yousafzai, who received the Nobel Prize after he tried to kill her, which she was maimed because she advocated for the education, literacy, and numeracy of Muslim women. She was a young girl. He tried to murder her. He murdered 132 Muslim children. This is what he does to his own children. Well, he was killed this week in prophecy by the United States. His assassination, his, let's call it removal as a military target, took place on the Kuna border region. Thank God he's gone. Now, in all likelihood, he is in hell. I would have much preferred to see even a man that wicked get saved and come to faith in Jesus. He killed 132 children. His own children. Muslim children. He's willing to murder Muslim little girls for the crime of wanting to go to school and learning how to read and write and count. What had happened? It's over. There has been a further deterioration this week in prophecy between Arab relations and Iran. Jordan has already removed its ambassador from Tehran. And it has announced this week in prophecy it has no plans to replace him or send another ambassador or to return him. Diplomatic relations between Jordan and Iran are only a thread now, with no ambassadorial presence. The reason cited by Jordan, the government of King Abdullah II, is simply Iranian involvement in sponsoring radical Islamic Shia Arab in the neighboring countries, which includes Jordan, taking place this week in prophecy. Again, in any Gog and Magog scenario, you see a conspicuous absence, with the limited exception of Libya, Put, in the constellation of nations coming against Israel, and this is interesting to watch. Again, we don't say that in alarmist terms, we simply point it out as something to be taken into account and borne in mind. This week in prophecy, a Turkish woman, Ibu Oskin, was arrested at Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv, for suspected membership in a terrorist organization. Now understand, although this is the arrest of one person of Turkish citizenship, the Erdogan regime in Turkey, committed to Islamizing Turkey and transforming it away from the original ideas of Ataturk as a secular state with separation of religion and state, is the kind of thing he would make much capital of for propaganda purposes, especially as his economy continues to disintegrate rapidly. Dictatorial figures like him, when they get in trouble economically, they try to play some kind of a nationalist card. We saw this when the Cultural Revolution got out of hand in China. And then Mao, in self-preservation, orchestrated an armed conflict on the Amur River with Russia, communists killing communists, to reconsolidate the nation that was dividing in the Cultural Revolution, the days of Zhou Enlai and the final days of Mao, or the final decade of Mao, before Nixon's visit. We also have seen this in Argentina with the Galtieri regime. The hyperinflation in the economy of Argentina collapsing, Galtieri and his junta grabbed the Falkland Islands, provoking a military conflict with Britain, in which Argentina was defeated and humiliated. This is what dictatorial figures do. When they get in trouble domestically, they play the hyper-nationalist card and provoke a conflict externally. Well, we know the support and certainly the rhetoric delivered by the Erdogan regime in Turkey in favor of radical pro-Islamic forces, especially Hamas, in Gaza, including Turkish participation in the flotillas. This has had very serious diplomatic and military ramifications for Turkey's membership within NATO, but also, of course, for Turkey's relationship with Israel. Turkey had been the Las Vegas for Israeli tourists. It's where they went to gamble and to be entertained. That has now stopped. The Israelis are flying now to Bulgaria, to the resort of Varna. That's their new Las Vegas. Turkey has lost all of that business. Israeli tourists were probably the largest gambling tourism market for Turkey. The man cannot think in terms of economic reality. He thinks in terms of Islamic radicalism and military dictatorship. A single event like the arrest of this woman could easily mushroom into a diplomatic crisis. But the fact that you now have Turkish involvement in terror, that is not to say necessarily Turkish government involvement, but involvement of Turks in Islamic terror, is a major, major consideration now. Understand, if you go back to the days of Lawrence of Arabia, the Turks subjugated the Arabs, so-called now Palestinian Arabs. They treated them as serfs. It was Lawrence of Arabia who organized the Arabs to fight the Turks. Now, under Erdogan, they become your Islamic brothers. The whole thing is absurd. The Turks never liked the Arabs. The Turks destroyed the Kaaba at one time in history. They actually destroyed the Kaaba. How things change. But remember, le plus le change, le plus le reste même. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy. Following the tentative agreements between North Korea and the United States, the world is wondering what is going to happen in the aftermath. While the United States has indefinitely suspended joint military operations with South Korea that are expensive to conduct, American military operations with Japan and independent American operations in the region will continue. The president refused to lift any trade boycotts or embargoes on North Korea, pending progress on North Korean commitments. He's not like Obama. He's not like the incompetent brokerage of agreements with Jimmy Carter, where North Korea got $5 billion in aid, agreed to stop nuclear development, and then didn't, and laughed all the way to the bank. Well, Jimmy Carter stood there with egg on his face. He didn't do that. Mr. Trump said the embargo stay in place, and our war games with Japan continue on the military footage, and we're not withdrawing any American troops until we see progress. He knows you cannot trust North Korea. In the meantime, though, what has happened in Singapore in those meetings sends a powerful signal to Iran. Look how the Americans dealt with North Korea. They economically isolated them, strategically stood up to them, and are demanding North Korea acquiesce to denuclearization demands. Now, the Trump strategy is to economically isolate Iran, to strategically stand up to Iran, and to play the same game, and Iran knows it. There are Iranian and Syrian delegations rushing to meet in Pyongyang with North Korea, as well as Russians. But particularly Iran and Syria are nervous in the aftermath of what this may mean. In the meantime, this week in prophecy, Iran has threatened to reinvigorate its nuclear enrichment program. Now, Mr. Trump warned them what would happen if they did, in broad, vague terms, saying that there would be severe repercussions. In other words, the deal was no good, but if you continue to if you continue to seek to attain a nuclear capacity strategically, there will be ramifications. 8,000 new IR-6 centrifuges capable of a 20% uranium enrichment have been put in place at the Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz, their second largest enrichment plant. Whether Iran is merely posturing or actually getting ready to reenact its enrichment of weapons-grade uranium, we shall see. The Iranian regime has already told the Europeans that if they follow the American boycotts, Iran will so act. American pressure is forcing major European industrial concerns, as we pointed out, to decide who they want to do business with. Watch this space. This is 8,000 upgraded centrifuges, the model known as IR-6, with a 20% enrichment capacity. Iran may be posturing, or it may be preparing, or it may go either way. But we know it was enacted this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, you have a situation in Australia similar to what you see with the establishment Republicans in the United States. The Republican Party in the United States has always been divided between actual conservatives, who were personified in the 1960s by figures such as the late Barry Goldwater, to another senator from Arizona, who is basically a Democrat sitting on the wrong side of the aisle, John McCain, Jeff Flake, people in the Bush camp, pseudo-conservatives who the Saudi Arabians carried around in their back pocket, people like James Baker, industrial interests from Bechtel and construction companies, as well as the oil industry interests, such as Dick Cheney, who was in favor of the Republican Party supporting same-sex marriage and so forth, because his lesbian daughter and his wife are married, together with Laura Bush supporting such things. These are the establishment Republicans, people like Romney, the Bush family, John McCain. They talk conservative, but they really aren't. Lindsey Graham being another one, Mitch McConnell being another, certainly John Boehner being another, Paul Ryan being another. That's the pseudo-conservative Republican Party establishment. Then you have the conservatives, the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, Mr. Trump, the libertarian contingent of the Republican Party led by Senator Rand Paul. So you've got the conservative Republicans and the pseudo-conservative Republican establishment. Well, you have the same thing in Australia. Although it's something of a misnomer, the Conservative Party, supposedly in Australia, are called the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party are called Labour. The Liberal Party base, supposedly the Conservative base, they were the party of John Howard, who was actually somewhat conservative, and in many respects a good Prime Minister for Australia. He may have been a believer, some people tell me. I'm not sure, but he certainly had evangelical sympathies. Be that as it may, the party base in Australia has voted to support Mr. Trump's position concerning Israel, demanding a curtailment or cessation of economic aid to the Palestinian Authority as long as they have their martyrs fund, quote unquote, paying the families of terrorists and suicide bombers, and wanting to follow the American and Guatemalan precedents of relocating their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is what the party base wanted. But the crooked establishment of the Liberal Party in Australia did not want to do what their membership voted for. It's much the same as Brexit in Britain. The rank and file conservatives in Britain were Brexit. The corrupt Tory party establishment of Theresa May wanted to remain in Europe. They don't care what the people voted for. You see this repeatedly in Ireland. Whenever the Irish people voted by referendum against Europe, the Irish government would just call another referendum of their own party. It didn't matter. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. These corrupt parties just don't care what the people want. It's pseudo-democracy. You see it in Britain, you see it in Ireland, you certainly see it in the United States with the pseudo-conservative Republican establishment, and we see it in Australia the same. Australia is no worse, no better, no different than the others. The Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, said that we will continue giving aid to the Palestinian Authority, but we will determine it will only go to the projects we want it to. The more you spend on their other projects, the more money they have to spend on terror, on the Martyr Fund, on giving economic inducements to people to commit suicide bombing. It's all political double talk. And against the will of their party base, they will not be moving the embassy. Again, this is just like the Bush family or Mitt Romney types in the United States. John Cain, Susan Collins, that kind of thing. It's all over. Fortunately, Brexit did prevail in Britain, thanks to people like Nigel Farage, but it's still a battle. And thankfully, Mr. Trump and Mr. Pence prevailed in the United States. No, they are not perfect, and I do not always agree with them. But given the alternative, and by the alternative, I don't only mean Hillary Clinton. I mean the alternative of the 16 establishment Republicans Mr. Trump defeated in the primaries. Every one of them. Every one of them. You had conservatives like Governor Huckabee and Senator Cruz, but most, and of course Dr. Ben Carson, but the rest were all establishment Republicans. Senator Nixon Durham was also a candidate. There were a minority of conservatives, but most of them were, again, Republican Party establishment. Vacillating political sycophants of the Bush family and the Bush dynasty. That's what they were. Most unfortunate. Understand there is a battle, and the battle is not simply political, it is spiritual. Now, it is not my place to pontificate on behalf of political causes, to endorse candidates or tell people who to vote for. I'm simply interpreting the political events in light of the book of Daniel that tell us that the political conflicts taking place on the earth are the result of spiritual conflicts in the heavenlies. And we've seen plenty of it this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, with American military advisors in civilian clothes, the Saudi Arabian and Emirate forces launched an offensive against the Iranian-backed and supplied and armed Houthi rebels in Yemen. They have largely conquered the Hudaydah airport, which is crucial to Iranian support. It is where Iranian supplied planes, one of the bases they were flying into. This must be chalked up as something of a victory and another setback for Iran. Now, obviously, it would not have been possible without American and British weapons and without American and possibly, I'm not sure, British advisors. It is to the interest of Saudi Arabia, it is to the indirect interest of Israel, certainly, and to the United States. But this was the first really significant land victory that has taken place in response to missiles now being fired at targets inside of adjacent Saudi Arabia. Again, things like that can send the oil markets into neurotic jitters very, very easily. But this has been a step forward this week in prophecy. Finally, this week in prophecy, another major development, well reported in Israel, but only somewhat reported in the international media. The Israelis have successfully developed and tested a new supersonic missile called the Rampage. Now, the Rampage is interesting. It is not primarily designed for ground launch systems. It may have the capacity to be modified for ground launching, for mobile launchers, but it is designed for airborne launching. You combine it with a well-outfitted F-16 or F-15, or better yet, a stealthy F-35. 4 of them, mounted on a single aircraft possibly. These Rampage missiles are hard to detect and very fast. They are designed for air-launched attack on command centers, air bases, and well-defended military facilities where you would have the deployment of Russian S-400 and even S-500 anti-aircraft missiles and anti-missile missiles. This has been a major step forward. The United States has similar weapons, but now Israel has developed its own version, the Rampage. Combined with the stealth technology of an F-35 or a modified F-16 or F-15, but particularly an F-35, you're launching from a stealthy F-35 at a distance, a supersonic missile launched from a close range, from a stealthy plane you might not be able to see until it was within 15 miles of firing range. Going at that speed, it would render useless the S-400 and probably the Russian S-500 anti-ballistic missile systems. This is very significant. Although technical details remain classified, it was announced by Eli Reiter, spokesman for IMI, Israel Military Industries. This capacity will prove to be a major factor in the containment of Iran and in the circumvention of any Russian sales of S-400 and S-500 anti-ballistic missile systems to client nations. This is important strategically. And it took place this week in prophecy. He's not a perfect man. We may not always agree with him. But we are told to pray for those in authority. Let us continue to pray for President Trump and Vice President Pence. Do I trust them? No. Do I pray for them? Yes. And I trust him, or at least I distrust him, less than I would have distrusted Hillary Clinton or an establishment Republican. May God bless him and continue to use him. I wish him nothing but the best for the good of the country and the free world. Let us continue to pray also for Rosh Hashanah, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And please pray for Nigel Farage and for the pro-Brexit forces in the British government and for the DUP in Northern Ireland. This is a separate issue, but Northern Ireland is the only place in Ireland and the only place in the United Kingdom now holding out against same-sex marriage and non-therapeutic abortion. And it's doing so because of the evangelical vote that you see in the Democratic Ulster parties, the Ulster Unionists. I may not agree with their politics in terms of unionism completely. They are vital for the survival of Theresa May's government. Otherwise, that woman would sell Britain down the river to Brussels in 2 seconds. They are also vital for the moral preservation of what is left of Britain and of Ireland. Please keep Britain and Brexit in prayer, as well as those parties in Northern Ireland. Thank you so much for listening. My name is James Jacob Prash. God bless. And remember, Jesus is coming soon. Tell the unsaved about him and his salvation. God bless.
Thank you, Jacob.